Hello, I'm Allison, and welcome to another episode of Listen Now, Read Later, the podcast that leads you to your next favorite novel by reading you short stories. As always, we will be tying together short fiction and long-form fiction so that after you listen now, you can read later. Episode 24, Watch What Happens. Today we're bringing you two short stories by L.M. Montgomery, where women have made plans, one to get married and the other to get revenge. Afterward, hear why Teresa has the perfect novel if these stories are your cup of tea. Lucy Maud Montgomery was a Canadian author who lived from 1874 to 1942. She is best known for the novel Anne of Green Gables and its sequels. A prolific writer, Montgomery wrote 20 novels and over 500 short stories and poems in her lifetime. In 1923, she became the first Canadian woman to be made a member of the British Royal Society of Arts. The stories by her that we're reading today are The Girl in the Wild Race and Mrs. March's Revenge, both of which were originally published in 1904. Project Gutenberg has collected L.M. Montgomery's short stories into chronologically ordered collections. We're reading The Girl in the Wild Race and Mrs. March's Revenge from their ebook, Lucy Maud Montgomery Short Stories, 1904. These stories are both in the public domain. We hope you enjoy. The Girl in the Wild Race by L.M. Montgomery.
If Judith would only get married.
Mrs. Theodora Whitney was wont to sigh dolorously. Now, there was no valid reason why Judith ought to get married unless she wanted to. But Judith was 27, and Mrs. Theodora thought it was a terrible disgrace to be an old maid.
There has never been an old maid in our family, so far back as we know of.
She lamented.
And to think that there should be one now. It just drags us down to the level of the McGregors. They have always been noted for their old maids.
Judith took all her aunt's lamentations good-naturedly. Sometimes she argued the subject placidly.
Why are you in such a hurry to be rid of me, Aunt Theo? I'm sure we're very comfortable here together, and you know you would miss me terribly if I went away.
If you took the right one, you wouldn't go so very far,
said Mrs. Theodora, darkly significant.
And anyhow, I'd put up with any amount of lonesomeness rather than have an old maid in the family. It's all very fine now, when you're still young enough and good-looking, with lots of beaux at your beck and call. But that won't last much longer. And if you go on with your dilly-dallying, you'll wake up some fine day to find that your time for choosing has gone by. Your mother used to be dreadful proud of your good looks when you was a baby. I told her she needn't be. 9 times out of 10, a beauty don't marry as well as an ordinary girl.
I'm not much set on marrying at all,
declared Judith sharply. Any reference to the right one always disturbed her placidity. The real root of the trouble was that Mrs. Theodora's right one and Judith's right one were two different people. The Ramble Valley young men were very fond of dancing attendance on Judith, even if she were verging on old maidenhood. Her prettiness was undeniable. The Stewarts came to maturity late, and at 27, Judith's dower of milky white flesh, dimpled red lips, and shining bronze hair was at its fullest splendor. Besides, she was jolly, and jollity went a long way in Ramble Valley popularity. Of all Judith's admirers, even King alone found favor in Mrs. Theodora's eyes. He owned the adjoining farm and was well off and homely, so homely that Judith declared it made her eyes ache to look at him. Bruce Marshall, Judith's right one, was handsome, but Mrs. Theodora looked upon him with sour disapproval. He owned a stony little farm at the remote end of Ramble Valley and was reputed to be fonder of many things than of work. To be sure, Judith had enough capability and energy for two, but Mrs. Theodora detested a lazy man. She ordered Judith not to encourage him, and Judith obeyed. Judith generally obeyed her aunt. But though she renounced Bruce Marshall, she would have nothing to do with Eben King or anybody else, and all Mrs. Theodora's grumblings did not mend matters. The afternoon that Mrs. Tony Mack came in, Mrs. Theodora felt more aggrieved than ever. Ellie McGregor had been married the previous week. Ellie, who was the same age as Judith and not half so good looking. Mrs. Theodora had been nagging Judith ever since.
But I might as well talk to the trees down there in that hollow,
She complained to Mrs. Tony.
That girl is so set and contrary-minded. She doesn't care a bit for my feelings.
This was not said behind Judith's back. The girl herself was standing at the open door, drinking in all that delicate, evasive beauty of the spring afternoon. The Whitney house crested a bare hill that looked down on misty intervals, feathered with young firs that were golden green in the pale sunlight. The fields were bare and smoking, although the lanes and shadowy places were full of moist snow. Judith's face was aglow with the delight of mere life, and she bent out to front the brisk, dancing wind that blew up from the valley, resinous with the odors of firs and damp mosses. At her aunt's words, the glow went out of her face. She listened with her eyes brooding on the hollow and the glowing flame of temper smoldering in them. Judith's long patience was giving away. She had been flicked on the raw too often of late, and now her aunt was confiding her grievances to Mrs. Tony Mack, the most notorious gossip in Ramble Valley or out of it.
I can't sleep at nights for worrying over what will become of her when I'm gone,
went on Mrs. Theodora dismally.
She'll just have to live on alone here, a lonesome, withered-up old maid. And her that might have had her pick, Mrs. Tony, though I do say it as shouldn't. You must feel real thankful to have all of your girls married off, especially when none of them was extra good-looking. Some people have all the luck. I'm tired of talking to Judith. Folks will be saying soon that nobody ever really wanted her, for all her flirting. But she just won't marry.
I will! Judith whirled about on the sun-warmed doorstep and came in. Her black eyes were flashing and her round cheeks were crimson.
Such a temper you never saw,
reported Mrs. Tony afterwards.
though 'tweren't to be wondered at. Theodora was most awful aggravating.
I will, repeated Judith stormily. I'm tired of being nagged day in and day out. I'll marry, and what is more is I'll marry the first man that asks me. That I will, if it is old widower Delane himself. How does that suit you, Aunt Theodora? Mrs. Theodora's mental processes were never slow. She dropped her knitting ball and stooped for it. In that time, she had decided what to do. She knew Judith would stick to her word, Stuart-like, and she must trim her sails to catch this new wind.
It suits me real well, Judith,
she said calmly.
You can marry the first man that asks you, and I'll say no word to hinder.
The color went out of Judith's face, leaving it pale as ashes. Her hasty assertion had no sooner been uttered than it was repented of, but she must stand by it now. She went out of the kitchen without another glance at her aunt or the delighted Mrs. Tony, and dashed up the stairs to her own little room, which looked out over the whole of Ramble Valley. It was warm with the March sunshine, and the leafless boughs of the creeper that covered the end of the house were tapping a gay tattoo on the window panes in the music of the wind. Judith sat down in her little rocker and dropped her pointed chin into her hands. Far down the valley, over the firs on the McGregor Hill and the blue mirror on the Craston Pond, Bruce Marshall's little gray house peeped out from a semicircle of white-stemmed birches. She had not seen Bruce since before Christmas. He had been angry at her then because she had refused to let him drive her home from prayer meeting. Since then, she had heard a rumor that he was going to see Kitty Lee at Upper Valley. Judith looked somberly down at the Marshall homestead. She had always loved the quaint, picturesque old place, so different from all that commonplace spick and span new houses of the prosperous valley. Judith had never been able to decide whether she really cared very much for Bruce Marshall or not, but she knew that she loved that rambling, cornery house of his, with the gable festooned with the real ivy that Bruce Marshall's great-grandmother had brought with her from England. Judith thought contrastingly of Eben King's staring, primrose-colored house in all its bare, intrusive grandeur. She gave a little shrug of distaste.
I wish Bruce knew of this, she thought, flushing even in her solitude at the idea. Although, if it is true that he is going to see Kitty Lee, I don't suppose he'd care. And Aunt Theo would be sure to send word to Eben by hook or crook. Whatever possessed me to say such a mad thing? There goes Mrs. Tony now, all agog to spread such delectable bit of gossip. Mrs. Tony had indeed gone, refusing Mrs. Theodora's invitation to stay to tea, so eager she was to tell her story. And Mrs. Theodora, at that very minute, was out in her kitchen yard giving her instructions to Potter Vane, the 12-year-old urchin who cut her wood and did sundry other chores for her.
Potter,
She said excitedly.
run over to the King's and tell Eben to come over here immediately, no matter what he's at. Tell him I want to see him about something of the greatest importance.
Mrs. Theodora thought that this was a master stroke.
That match is as good as made.
She thought triumphantly as she picked up chips to start the tea fire.
If Judith suspects that Eben is here, she is quite likely to stay in her room and refuse to come down. But if she does, I'll march him upstairs to her door and make him ask her through the keyhole. You can't stump Theodora Whitney.
Alas, 10 minutes later, Potter returned with the unwelcome news that Eben was away from home.
He went to Wexbridge about half an hour ago, his ma said. She said she'd tell him to come right over as soon as he came home.
Mrs. Theodora had to content herself with this, but she felt troubled. She knew Mrs. Tony Mack's capabilities for spreading news. What if Bruce Marshall should hear it before Eben? That evening, Jacob Plowden's store at Wexbridge was full of men, sitting about on kegs and counters or huddling around the stove, for the March air had grown sharp as the sun lowered in the creamy sky over the Ramble Valley hills. Eben King had a keg in the corner. He was in no hurry to go home, for he loved gossip dearly, and the Wexbridge store abounded with it. He was exhausted with the news of Peter Stanley's store across the bridge, and now he meant to hear what was saying at Plowden's. Bruce Marshall was here, too, buying groceries and being waited on by Nora Plowden, who was by no means averse to the service, although as a rule her father's customers received scanty tolerance at her hands.
What are the valley roads like, Marshall?
Asked a Wexbridge man between 2 squirts of tobacco juice.
Bad.
Said Bruce briefly.
Another warm day, you'll finish the sleighing.
Are they crossing at Malley's Creek yet?
Asked Plowden.
No, Jack Carr got in there day before yesterday. Nearly lost his mare. I came round by the main road.
Responded Bruce. The door opened at this point and Tony Mack came in. As soon as he closed the door, he doubled up in a fit of chuckles, which lasted until he was purple in the face.
Is the man crazy?
Demanded Plowden, who had never seen lean little Tony visited like this before.
Crazy nothing!
Retorted Tony.
You'll laugh too when you hear it. Such a joke. Theodora Whitney has been badgering Judith Stewart so much about being an old maid that Judith got mad and vowed she'll marry the first man that asks her. My old woman was there and heard her. She'll keep her word too. She ain't old Joshua Stewart's daughter for nothing. If he said he'd do a thing, he did it if it tucked the hair off. If I was a young feller now,
Bruce Marshall swung round on one foot. His face was crimson, and if looks could kill, Tony Mack would have fallen dead in the middle of his sniggers.
You needn't mind doing up that parcel for me,
He said to Nora.
I'll not wait for it.
On his way to the door, Eben King brushed past him. A shout of laughter from the assembled men followed them. The others streamed out in their wake, realizing that a race was afoot. Tony alone remained inside, helpless with chuckling. Eben King's horse was tied at the door. He had nothing to do but step in and drive off. Bruce had put his mare in at Billy Bender's across the bridge, intending to spend the evening there. He knew that this would handicap him seriously, but he strode down the road with a determined expression on his handsome face. 15 minutes later, he drove past the store, his gray mare going on a sharp gait. The crowd in front of Plowden's cheered him. Their sympathies were with him, for King was not popular. Plowden had come out and shouted,
Here's luck to you, brother!
After which he doubled up with renewed laughter. Such a lark! And he, Tony, had set it afoot. It would be a story to tell for years. Marshall, with his lips set and his dreamy gray eyes for once glittering with a steely light, urged Lady Jane up the Wexbridge Hill. From its top, it was 5 miles to Ramble Valley by the main road. A full mile ahead of him, he saw Eben King, getting along through mud and slush and occasional big slumpy drifts of old snow. as fast as his clean-limbed trotter could carry him. As a rule, Eben was exceedingly careful of his horses, but now he was sending Bay Billy along for all that was in him. For a second, Bruce hesitated. Then he turned his mare down the field to cut Mally's Creek. It was taking Lady Jane's life and possibly his own in his hand, but it was his only chance. He could never have overtaken Bay Billy on the main road.
Do your best, Lady Jane,
he muttered, and Lady Jane plunged down the steep hillside through the gluttonous mud of the plowed fields as if she meant to do it. Beyond the field was a ravine full of firs through which Mally's Creek ran. To cross it meant a 4-mile cut to Ramble Valley. The ice looked black and rotten. To the left was the ragged hole where Jack Carr's mare had struggled for her life. Bruce headed Lady Jane higher up. If a crossing could be made at all, it was only between Mally's spring hole and the old ice road. Lady Jane swerved at the bank and whickered.
On, old girl,
said Bruce in a tense voice. Unwillingly, she advanced, picking her steps with cat-like sagacity. Once her foot went through, Bruce pulled her up with hands that did not tremble. The next moment, she was scrambling up the opposite bank. Glancing back, Bruce saw the ice parting in her footsteps and black water gurgling up. But the race was not decided yet. By crossing the creek, he had won no more than an equal chance with Eben King, and the field road before him was much worse than the main road. There was little snow on it and some bad sloughs, but Lady Jane was good for it. For once, she should not be spared. Just as the red ball of the sun touched the wooded hills of the valley, Mrs. Theodora, looking from the cow stable door, saw 2 sleighs approaching, the horses of which were going at a full gallop. One was trundling down the main road, headlong through old drifts and slumpy snow, where a false step might send the horse floundering to the bottom. The other was coming up from the direction of the creek, full tilt through Tony Mac's stump land, where not a vestige of snow coated the huge roots over which the runners bumped. For a moment, Mrs. Theodora stood at a gaze. Then she recognized both drivers. She dropped her milking pail and ran to the house, thinking as she ran. She knew that Judith was alone in the kitchen. If Eben King got here first, well and good. But if Bruce Marshall won the race, he must encounter her, Mrs. Theodora.
He won't propose to Judith as long as I'm round.
She panted.
I know him. He's too shy. But Eben won't mind. I'll tip him the wink.
Potter Vane was chopping wood before the door. Mrs. Theodora, recognizing him in a further obstacle to Marshall's wooing, caught him unceremoniously by the arm and hauled him, axe and all, over the doorstone and into the kitchen, just as Bruce Marshall and Eben King drove into the yard, with not a second to spare between them. There was a woeful cut of Bay Billy's slender foreleg, and the reeking Lady Jane was trembling like a leaf. The staunch little mare had brought her master over the stretch of sticky field road in time, but she was almost exhausted. Both men sprang from their sleighs and ran to the door. Bruce Marshall won it by a foot room and burst into the kitchen with his rival hot on his heels. Mrs. Theodora stood defiantly in the middle of the room, still grasping the dazed and dismayed Potter. In a corner, Judith turned from the window when she had begun watching the finish of the race. She was pale and tense from excitement. In those few gasping moments, she had looked on her heart as an open book. She knew at last that she loved Bruce Marshall, and her eyes met his fiery gray ones as he sprang over the threshold.
Judith, will you marry me?
Gasped Bruce, before Eben, who had first looked at Mrs. Theodora and the squirming Potter, had located the girl. Yes, said Judith. She burst into hysterical tears as she said it and sat limply down in a chair. Mrs. Theodora loosed her grip on Potter.
You can go back to your work,
she said dully. She followed him out, and Eben King followed her. On the step, she reached behind him and closed the door.
Trust a king for being too late,
she said bitterly and unjustly. Eben went home with Bay Billy. Potter gazed after him until Mrs. Theodora ordered him to put Marshall's mare in the stable and rub her down.
Anyway, Judith won't be an old maid,
she comforted herself.
We hope you enjoyed our first story. Now here's Mrs. March's Revenge by L.M. Montgomery.
I declare, it is a real fall day,
said Mrs. Stopp, dropping into a chair with a sigh of relief as Mrs. March ushered her into the cozy little sitting room.
The wind would chill the marrow in your bones. Winter'll be here before you know it.
That's so, assented Mrs. March, bustling about to stir up the fire. But I don't know as I mind it at all. Winter is real pleasant when it does come, but I must say, I don't fancy these betwixt and between days. Sit up to the fire, Theodosia. You look real blue.
I feel so too. Lawful heart, but this is comfort. This chimney corner of yours, Anna, is the coziest spot in the world.
When did you get home from Maitland? Asked Mrs. March. Did you have a pleasant time? And how did you leave Emily and the children? Mrs. Stopp took this trio of interrogations in calm detail.
I came home Saturday,
she said as she unrolled her knitting.
Nice wet day it was too. And as for my visit, yes, I enjoyed myself pretty. Well, not but what I worried over Peter's rheumatism a good deal. Emily is well, and the children ought to be, for such rampageous young ones I never saw. Emily can't do no more with them than an old hen with a brood of ducks. But lawful heart, Anna, don't mind about my little affairs. The news Peter had for me about you when I got home fairly took my breath. He came down to the garden gate to shout it before I was out of the wagon. I couldn't believe but what he was joking at first. You should have seen Peter. He had an old red shawl tied round his rheumatic shoulder, and he was waving his arms like a crazy man. I declare I thought the chimney was afire. Theodosia, Theodosia, he shouted. Anna March has had a fortune left her by her brother in Australia, and she's bought the old Carroll place and is going to move up there. That was his salute when I got home. I'd have been over before this to hear all about it, but things were at such 6s and 7s in the house that I couldn't go visiting until I'd straightened them out a bit. Peter's real neat, as men go, but lawful heart, such a mess as he makes of housekeeping. I didn't know you had a brother living.
No more did I, Theodosia. I thought, as everyone else did, that poor Charles was at the bottom of the sea 40 years ago. It's that long since he ran away from home. He had a quarrel with father, and he was always dreadful high-spirited. He went to sea, and we heard that he had sailed for England in the Helen Ray. She was never heard of after, and we all supposed that my poor brother had perished with her. And 4 weeks ago, I got a letter from a firm of lawyers in Melbourne, Australia, saying that my brother, Charles Bennet, had died and left all his fortune to me. I couldn't believe it at first, but they sent me some things of his that he had when he left home, and there was an old picture of myself among them with my name written on it in my own hand. So then I knew there was no mistake. But whether Charles did sail in the Helen Ray, or if he did, how he escaped from her and got to Australia, I don't know, and it isn't likely I ever will.
Well, of all wonderful things,
commented Mrs. Stopp. I was glad to hear that I was heir to so much money, said Mrs. March firmly. At first, I felt as if it were awful of me to be glad when it came to me by my brother's death. But I mourned for poor Charles 40 years ago, and I can't sense that he has only just died. Not but what I'd rather have seen him come home alive than have all the money in the world, but it has come about otherwise, and as the money is lawfully mine, I may as well feel pleased about it.
And you've bought the Carroll place,
said Mrs. Stopp with the freedom of a privileged friend.
Whatever made you do it? I'm sure you are as cozy here as need be, and nobody but yourself. Isn't this house big enough for you?
No, it isn't. All my life, I've been hankering for a good, big, roomy house, and all my life I've had to put up with little boxes of places, not big enough to turn around in. I've been contented and made the best of what I had, but now that I can afford it, I mean to have a house that will suit me. The Carroll house is just what I want, for all it is a little old-fashioned. I've always had a notion of that house, although I never expected to own it any more than the moon.
It's a real handsome place,
admitted Mrs. Stopp.
But I expect it will need a lot of fixing up. Nobody has lived in it for 6 years. When are you going to move in?
In about 3 weeks, if all goes well. I'm having it all painted and done over inside. The outside can wait until the spring.
It's queer how things come about,
said Mrs. Stopp meditatively.
I guess old Mrs. Carroll never imagined her home was going to pass into other folks' hands as it was. When you and I were girls and Louise Carroll was giving herself such airs over us, you didn't much expect to ever stand in her shoes, did you? Do you remember, Lou?
Yes, I do, said Mrs. March sharply. A change came over her sonsy, smiling face. It actually looked hard and revengeful, and a cruel light flickered in her dark eyes. I'll not forget Lou Carroll as long as I live. She is the only person in this world I ever hated. I suppose it is sinful to say, but I hate her still, and I always will.
I never liked her myself,
Admitted Mrs. Stopp.
She thought herself above us all. Well, for that matter, I suppose she was. But she needn't have rubbed it in so.
Well, she might have been above me, said Mrs. March bitterly, but she wasn't above twitting and snubbing me every chance she got. She always had a spite at me from the time we were children together at school. When we grew up, it was worse. I couldn't begin to tell you all the times that girl insulted me. But there was once in particular, I'll never forgive her for it. I was at a party, and she was there too, and so was that young Trennan Manning, who was visiting the Ashleys. Do you remember him, Doja? He was a handsome young fellow, and Lou had a liking for him, so all the girls said. But he never looked at her that night, and he kept by me the whole time. It made Lou furious, and at last she came up to me with a sneer on her face and her black eyes just snapping and said, Miss Bennet, Mother told me to tell you to tell your ma that if that plain sewing isn't done by tomorrow night, she'll send for it and give it to somebody else. If people engage to have work done by a certain time and don't keep their word, they needn't expect to get it. Oh, how badly I felt. Mother and I were poor and had to work hard, but we had feelings just like other people. And to be insulted like that before Trennan Manning, I just burst out crying then and there and ran away and hid. It was very silly of me, but I couldn't help it. That stings me yet. If I was ever to get a chance to pay Lou Carroll out for that, I'd take it without any compunction.
Oh, but that is unchristian,
protested Mrs. Stopp feebly. Perhaps so, but it's the way I feel. Old Parson Jones used to say that people were marbled good and bad pretty even, but that in everybody there were one or two streaks just pure wicked. I guess Lou Carroll is my wicked streak. I haven't seen or heard of her for years, ever since she married that worthless Dency Baxter and went away. She may be dead for all I know. I don't expect ever to have a chance to pay her out. But mark what I say, Theodosia. If I ever have, I will. Mrs. March snipped off her thread as if she challenged the world. Mrs. Stopp felt uncomfortable over the unusual display of feeling she had evoked and hastened to change the subject. In 3 weeks' time, Mrs. March was established in her new home, and the old Carroll house blossomed into renewed splendor. Theodosia Stopp, who had dropped in to see it, was in rapture of admiration.
You have a lovely home now, Anna. I used to think it was fine enough in the Carrolls' time, but it wasn't as grand as this. And that reminds me, I have something to tell you, but I don't want you to get as excited as you did the last time I mentioned her name. You remember the last day I was to see you, we were talking of Lou Carroll? Well, next day, I was downtown in a store, and who should sail in but Mrs. Joel Kent from Oriental. You know Mrs. Joel? Sarah Chapel, that was? She and her man keep a little hotel up at Oriental. They're not very well off. She is a cousin of old Mrs. Carroll, but lawful heart, the Carrolls didn't used to make much of that relationship. Well, Mrs. Joel and I had a chat. She told me all her troubles. She always has lots of them. Sarah was always of grumbling turn, and she had a brand new stock of them this time. What do you think, Anna March? Lou Carroll, or Mrs. Baxter, I suppose I should say, is up there at Joel Kent's in Oriental, dying of consumption. Leastwise, Mrs. Joel says she is.
Lou Carroll dying at Oriental? Cried Mrs. March.
Yes, she came there from goodness knows where about a month ago. Might as well have dropped from the clouds, Mrs. Joel says, for all she expected of it. Her husband is dead, and I guess he led her a life of it when he was alive, and she's as poor as second skimmings. She was aiming to come here, Mrs. Joel says, but when she got to Oriental, she wasn't fit to stir a step further, and the Kents had to keep her. I gather from what Mrs. Joel said that she's rather touched in her mind, too, and has an awful hankering to get home here, to this very house. She appears to have the idea that it is hers, and all just the same as it used to be. I guess she is a sight of trouble, and Mrs. Joel ain't the woman to like that. But there, she has to work most awful hard, and I suppose a sick person doesn't come in handy in a hotel. I guess you've got your revenge, Anna, without lifting a finger to get it. Think of Lou Carroll coming to that.
The next day was cold and raw. The ragged, bare trees in the old Carroll grounds shook and writhed in the gusts of wind. Now and then a drifting scud of rain dashed across the windows. Mrs. March looked out with a shiver and turned thankfully to her cozy fireside again. Presently she thought she heard a low knock at the front door and went to see. As she opened it, a savage swirl of damp wind rushed in, and the shrinking figure leaning against one of the fluted columns of the Grecian porch seemed to cower before its fury. It was a woman who stood there, a woman whose emaciated face wore a piteous expression as she lifted it to Mrs. March.
You don't know me, of course,
she said with a feeble attempt at dignity.
I am Mrs. Baxter. I used to live here long ago. I thought I'd walk over today and see my old home.
A fit of coughing interrupted her words, and she trembled like a leaf. Gracious me, exclaimed Mrs. March blankly. You don't mean to tell me that you have walked over from Oriental today, and a sick woman. For pity's sake, come in quick, and if you're not wet to the skin. She fairly pulled her visitor into the hall and led her to the sitting room. Sit down. Take this big, easy chair right up to the fire. So. Let me take your bonnet and shawl. I must run right out to tell Hannah to get you a hot drink.
You are very kind,
whispered the other.
I don't know you, but you look like a woman I used to know when I was a girl. She was a Mrs. Bennet, and she had a daughter, Anna. Do you know what became of her? I forget everything now.
My name is March, said Mrs. March briefly, ignoring the question. I don't suppose you've ever heard it before. She wrapped her own warm shawl around the other woman's thin shoulders. Then she hastened to the kitchen and soon returned, carrying a tray of food and a steaming hot drink. She wheeled a small table up to her visitor's side and said, very kindly, Now, take a bite, my dear, and this raspberry vinegar will warm you right up. It is a dreadful day for you to be out. Why on earth didn't Joel Kent drive you over?
They didn't know I was coming,
whispered Mrs. Baxter anxiously.
I ran away. Sarah wouldn't have let me come if she'd known. But I wanted to come so much. It's just so nice to be home again.
Mrs. March watched her guests as she ate and drank. It was plain enough that her mind, or rather her memory, was affected. She did not realize that this was no longer her home. At moments, she seemed to fancy herself back in the past again. Once or twice, she called Mrs. March mother. Presently, a sharp knock was heard at the hall door. Mrs. March excused herself and went out. In the porch stood Theodosia Stopp and a woman whom Mrs. March did not at first glance recognize. A tall, aggressive-looking person whose sharp black eyes darted in past Mrs. March and searched every corner of the hall before anyone had time to speak.
Lawful heart,
puffed Mrs. Stopp as she stepped in out of the biting wind.
I'm right out of breath. Mrs. March, allow me to introduce Mrs. Kent. We're looking for Mrs. Baxter. She has run away, and we thought perhaps she came here. Did she?
She is in my sitting room now, said Mrs. March quietly.
Didn't I say so?
Demanded Mrs. Kent, turning to Mrs. Stopp. She spoke in a sharp, high-pitched tone that grated on Mrs. March's nerves.
Doesn't she beat all? She slipped away this morning when I was busy in the kitchen. And to think of her walking 6 miles over here in this wind. I don't know how she did it. I don't believe she's half as sick as she pretends. Well, I've got my wagon out here, Mrs. March, and I'll be much obliged if you tell her I'm here to take her home. I suppose we'll have a fearful scene.
I don't see that there is any call for a scene, said Mrs. March firmly. The poor woman just got here, and she thinks she has got home. She might as well think so, if it is any comfort to her. You'd better leave her here. Theodosia gave a stifled gasp of amazement, but Mrs. March went serenely on. I'll take care of the poor soul as long as she needs it, and that will not be very long in my opinion, for if ever I saw death in a woman's face, it is looking out of hers. I've plenty of time to look after her and make her comfortable. Mrs. Joel Kent was voluble in her thanks. It was evident that she was delighted to get the sick woman off her hands. Mrs. March cut her short with an invitation to stay to tea, but Mrs. Kent declined.
I've got to hurry home straight off and get the men's suppers. Such a scamper to have over that woman. I'm sure I'm thankful you're willing to let her stay, for she'd never be contented anywhere else. I'll send over what few things she has tomorrow.
When Mrs. Kent had gone, Mrs. March and Mrs. Stopp looked at each other.
And so this is your revenge, Anna March?
Said the latter solemnly.
Do you remember what you had said to me about her?
Yes, I do, Theodosia, and I thought I meant every word of it, but I guess my wicked streak ran out just when I needed it to depend on. Besides, you see, I've thought of Lou Carroll all these years as she was when I knew her, handsome and saucy and proud, but that poor creature in there isn't any more like the Lou Carroll I knew than you are, not a mite. The old Lou Carroll is dead already, and my spite is dead with her. Will you come in and see her?
Well, no, not just now. She wouldn't know me, and Mrs. Joel says strangers kind of excite her. A pretty bad place the hotel would be for her at that rate, I should think. I must go and tell Peter about it, and I'll send up some of my black currant jam for her.
When Mrs. Stopp had gone, Mrs. March went back to her guest. Lou Baxter had fallen asleep with her head pillowed on the soft plush back of her chair. Mrs. March looked at the hollow, hectic cheeks and the changed, wasted features, and her bright brown eyes softened with tears. Poor Lou, she said softly, as she brushed a loose lock of gray hair back from the sleeping woman's brow. Now that you've listened, here's what to read later. Isn't it just lovely reading an L.M. Montgomery story? They remind us of the sweetest things in life. Never do they center around actual objects, but around the most wonderful intangibles that add to our lives. Love, forgiveness, family, friendship. Montgomery has a special knack for romanticizing the small stories to touch us all. What happens in the end? Maybe it's not what you expected, but it is what you will remember. So if you love to follow a unique plot unfold, if you can appreciate joy in even the darkest of surroundings, if you can see the significance in the small things, and if you have faith in things unseen, then you have to read Klara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro. Klara is an android built for friendship. Her purpose is to be the companion of a child, and as she sits in the shop window charging in the sun, she hopes she will get to serve this purpose. An especially observant artificial friend, Klara wins the heart of Josie, a 13-year-old girl who suffers from spells of illness. Josie whisks her away from the bustling, loud city to the sunny country. As she spends her days accompanying Josie to social events and spending time with her family, she observes the funny and complex ways the humans interact with each other. Klara dedicates herself to Josie's service and strives to take care of her always, believing she can help with even Josie's illness. Always observing, always cataloging, Klara may not notice when someone is watching her. Klara and the Sun is a science fiction story so unlike anything you've ever read before. Where sci-fi can often seem cold and distant, this story is brought alive by the warmth of its characters. The story still speculates on the future and contains a vast and troubled world, but it remains distinctly human despite its non-human main character. Somehow simultaneously eerie and romantic, the story leaves you with an experience unlike any other. So if you enjoyed today's stories by L.M. Montgomery, then you have to read Klara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro. Thanks for listening to this episode of Listen Now, Read Later. Follow us on Instagram for fun extras and updates on our next episode. Want to support local booksellers and this podcast? Buy Klara and the Sun and any other books you like through our bookshop.org affiliate store. Now it's time for you to go read the book, and we'll catch you when you listen later.